Executions in the Middle Ages were terrifying and bloody. During the Middle Ages, the brutality of the death penalty was only matched by the creativity of the ways people were tortured. In this case, cutting off the head was thought to be the least painful way to die. Between the end of the Roman Empire and the start of the Renaissance, there were about 1,000 years called the Middle Ages. At that time, the ways people were tortured were nothing less than cruel. In the Middle Ages, people were put to death by boiling them alive or hitting them over the head with an animal. The goal of these harsh methods was to keep thieves away, but they didn't always work. People still broke the law, and bad things happened as a result. Hanged, drawn, and quartered, a multi-step medieval execution. High treason was one of the worst crimes in England in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, people were hanged, drawn, and quartered as a way to kill them. This was because the punishment had to fit the act. At that time, drawn just meant that someone was pulled by a horse to their final goal. But this word could also mean drawing someone's innards out of their body later on in the process, which was much grosser. The next step, which is to be hung, is clear, but a lot of the time, the person didn't die from being hung. Instead, the person being put to death would be hung until he was almost dead, and then he would be let go, so he would still be living for the real horror, being quartered. In the beginning, the prisoner was castrated by throwing his private parts, and sometimes his innards, into a fire. The prisoner's head was then cut off. The last step, which is what the word quartering meant, was to cut the body into at least 4 pieces and throw them into a pot of boiling spices. This stopped birds from eating the bodies and let the body parts be shown to people all over the country as a scary warning. This way of killing people was used all over Europe, even though it is usually thought of as a British sentence. The most well-known person to suffer this fate was William Wallace, because his fight in the 2900s to free Scotland from English rule was fundamentally treasonous. The way Wallace was killed was even worse in real life than it was in the 1995 movie Braveheart. Wallace was pulled by 4 different horses, each of which was attached to one of his arms. This was usually done to prisoners that the king didn't like. Wallace's body was widely dumped all over England after he was put to death as a warning to other people who might be traitors. Strangely, this was done for about 500 years after Wallace's notorious hanging, until it was finally made illegal in 1803. The bloody truth about beheadings. Ancient Greeks and Romans thought that cutting off a person's head was a proper way to die. In the Middle Ages, a lot of people thought the same thing, especially since beheading was seen as a more humane way to kill someone than the other options. Unfortunately for some of the first victims, an axe was often used to kill them. In later times, swords were made to be more powerful, and victims usually died pretty quickly. In the Middle Ages, cutting was thought to be the most honorable way to die because it was one of the least painful ways to kill someone. That's why nobles, heroes, and other royal people were usually the only ones who could be beheaded. Tradition says that William the Conqueror brought the practice of cutting off someone's head with a sword to England in the 1100s. The victim was often told to stand or sit up straight because a block could have stopped the sword from cutting down. Of course, beheading did not stop when the Middle Ages ended. In 1587, after 19 years of imprisonment, Mary, Queen of Scots, was so grateful for her beheading that she told her own executioner, "I hope you shall make an end of all my troubles." Meanwhile, King Henry VIII was so adamant about Anne Boleyn's decapitation in 1536 that he sent for an expert swordsman from France to do the deed. On the day of her execution, Boleyn reportedly exclaimed, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." In 1541, Margaret Pole didn't have as much fun. People in high society were usually beheaded with a sword, but the Countess of Salisbury was killed with an axe. It was said that the killer was a careless youth who hacked her head and shoulders to pieces. Even though there were many problems with cutting, it was still a common way to kill people for hundreds of years. In England, the last person to be killed by being beheaded was Simon, Lord Lovat, in 1747. Death by elephant, one of the most brutal medieval execution methods. For thousands of years, people have tamed and taught elephants to do many different tasks. Elephants have always been used to great effect, from helping armies to helping people cross mountains. In the 12th century, these huge animals even helped build Angkor Wat, the famous Cambodian temple complex. Even now, people of the Buddhist and Hindu faiths worship elephants, but not many people know that they were used as punishment animals in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the death penalty was terrible in every way, but being killed by an elephant almost seems too horrible to be true. The phrase death by elephant was first used in India and is most common in Southeast Asia. Standardized in the Middle Ages, this way of killing people sometimes made its way to the West. It wasn't until the 19th century that it became less popular. Usually, enemy troops or civilians who did bad things like tax evasion and theft were the ones who were killed by elephant. As you might expect, individuals were put to death by letting an elephant crush them, generally by pressing on their head or stomach with one foot. But sometimes executioners thought of more clever ways to do things. During one Delhi Sultanate, elephants were trained to cut people open with pointed blades fitted to their tusks, and the deaths of prisoners were shown to the public. Elephants, unlike tigers and lions, don't typically want to kill people, but they can be taught to. What's scarier is that they can be taught to hurt people in certain ways before killing them. The elephant might, for instance, break a criminal's limbs before killing them with a blow to the head. This was often done to show that a king had power. This way of execution wasn't just used in the Middle Ages, it was used for hundreds of years in India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, among other places. People were killed by elephants until the late 1800s, when the practice seems to have stopped.
Crushing with weights. Some people thought the British would crush people with animals, but they did crush people with weights, like big stones and other heavy things. It's scary that people who were crushed hadn't even been found guilty of anything. Instead, the pressing was meant to force them to make a plea. Crushing was one of many ways people were put to death in the Middle Ages that were first used to get suspected thieves to confess. It was only for people who wouldn't say whether they were guilty or not guilty of a crime. The person usually died, though, when this method was used. England's method of crushing goes back to the 1300s and was still used well into the 1600s. These people were slowly smothered by weights being put on top of them. During the process, their bones would break and go through their skin sometimes. Margaret Clitheroe was famously crushed to death because she wouldn't plead guilty to charges that she was a Catholic and lived with priests. In 1586, she was dragged to a bridge while naked and forced to make a plea. Because she never did, ropes were tied around her and her legs were stretched out. Then, a door was put on top of her. Stones weighing about 800 pounds were piled on top of her until her back broke and her ribs came out of her skin. The Catholic Church made her a saint in 1970 because of how strong she was and how sad her death was. But the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts after the Middle Ages may have been the most famous time for killing. It got really crazy in the village in 1692, and about 200 people were charged of witchcraft. Because of how bad the fear was, a special court was set up to hear the cases, which led to 20 executions. One of the people named was Giles Corey. The old farmer had a bad name because he killed an apple thief with his bare hands almost 20 years ago. Because of this, he was finally accused of witchcraft during the anti-witch craze. Because he refused to go to trial, the police ordered a crushing in the hopes that he would at least make a plea. While being stripped naked and having a board put on his chest, Corey knew how this would end. He could say he wasn't guilty and be put to death for being a witch, or he could stay strong and die with honor, letting his live relatives keep his land. The farmer did nothing but ask for more weight to be added so that he would die quickly while he was being crushed. His body held out for about 2 days before it gave out. England finally outlawed this revolting practice in 1772.
Death by gibbet. Criminals were put in boxes that looked like people and then hung up in public places to scare other people away. This was called gibbeting. The wooden frame from which the cage was hung is called the gibbet. In some cases, people were already dead before they were gibbeted. Others, though, were still alive when they were left to die of being out in the cold and not having enough food. When they were living, gibbeted people were immobile and horrifying, and when they died, they smelled awful. People often forget that gibbeting has its roots in the Middle Ages because it was such a common punishment in Britain in the 1740s. Still, many people were put to death by being trapped in this horrible machine before that. People in charge of the Anabaptist movement in Germany were gibbeted in Münster in 1536. The steel cages are still on show today. Gibbets are also on show in the UK, and one of them even has skull parts inside it. What's interesting about gibbeting is that it didn't happen that frequently, said Sarah Tarlow, Professor of Archaeology at the University of Leicester. But it made a big splash, a big impression, when it did. England's love of gibbeting reached its peak in the 1740s. The 1752 Murder Act even forced convicted murderers to have their bodies either publicly dissected or gibbeted. People often came in large groups to see public gibbetings. As expected, people who lived near a gibbet were not excited. It would smell bad, said Tarlow. You can imagine what it was like just to have a decomposing body there, especially at the beginning when there was still soft tissue. The contraption was hung up about 30 feet in the air to make sure no one took it down. That way, a prisoner's body could stay in the cage for years, rattling in the wind. While the bodies were still alive, birds and bugs would eat the bones. Women were spared from the gibbets, but not out of gentlemanly deferment. Rather, women's bodies were hot property for surgeons and anatomists, Tarlow explained. This style of gibbeting went out of style in 1832, but from 1752 to 1832, 134 men were hung in chains, and it wasn't a crime again until 1834. The Viking blood eagle. The Viking Age was one of the most artistically pleasing times in the Middle Ages. During this time, Norse fighters came to different parts of Europe to raid, trade, and settle down. It was also said to have seen killing methods that were specific to the culture. Perhaps the blood eagle was the most horrifying because it was made for payback and ritual torture. The Orkneyinga saga and Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla are the only two stories that talk about the blood eagle. The writing of these texts happened at least 200 years after the first blood eagle events. In 867 AD, one of the first people thought to have been killed in this way. The first person who got hurt was Aella, king of Northumbria. He is said to have killed Ragnar Lothbrok, the leader of the Vikings, by throwing him into a pit of snakes. Because of this, Lothbrok's sons attacked England in 865 and got Aella killed by a blood eagle. Modern historians argue a lot about how the Vikings did this kind of symbolic torture and whether they even did it at all in the Middle Ages. In fact, it looks almost too horrible to be true. It went like this, though, if it did happen. The victim's hands and legs would be tied together so they couldn't move quickly. The killer would then start by stabbing the person in the tailbone and work their way up to the ribcage. Then, with great care, an axe was used to separate each rib from the backbone. Vikings would put salt on the open wound to keep the person awake while showing off the person's internal parts. The last thing the killer would do is pull the victim's lungs out, making 2 red wings. People have said that the blood eagle is both a traditional way to kill someone and a way to get revenge. The first one was meant to praise Odin, who was the father of the Norse gods and the god of war. The latter, on the other hand, wanted to punish dishonest people in the worst way possible. But since these 2 writings are the only proof of the blood eagle, scholars are still arguing about whether or not the practice is real. Ragnar Lothbrok and his death are, after all, partly mythical, with the stories being nothing more than Viking entertainment and storytelling. Alfred Smythe is a controversial scholar who is sure that the blood eagle existed. One piece of proof he uses is the Old Norse word blodorn, which meant something in that language. The drawings on the Stora Hammars stones in Gotland, Sweden, add to the evidence that the blood eagle existed. In one scene, a man is about to be cut open in the back while a bird of prey hangs over him. Death by boiling. The act of boiling someone to death was unbearably painful. Before the Middle Ages, the Roman Emperor Nero is said to have killed thousands of Christians this way. Later, it was also a common way to punish people who made fake coins, especially in the Holy Roman Empire. Later, King Henry VIII of Britain started boiling people to death as a way to kill people who had used poison to kill someone. As you might expect, those who were given this punishment were just put in a big pot of hot liquid, which could have been water, oil, wax, or even molten lead. After that, they were pretty much cooked. It was horrible to feel like you were being boiled alive. For the way to be even worse, the water might not have been at full boil when the person was put in it. Most of the time, the arms and extremities were the first things to catch fire. The innards of the person started to cook after the outside started to cook. The temperatures of the fluids went up until they were boiling too. Everyone who was put to death in this medieval process could only pray for a quick and painless end. The process of cooking to death was, however, very slow. The only way for someone to die quickly is if they were dipped in hot water. They might also be able to speed things up by putting their head under the water to make their brains boil. Besides that, it was long and painful until the very end. Certainly one of the worst ways to die in the Middle Ages was to be boiled to death. The target would probably still be awake, so he would feel his eyes burning, his clothes melting into his body, and his skin getting blisters. This should have only been used for the worst criminals, but it quickly became the choice way to kill forgers of all kinds. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, coining was such a terrible crime in France and Germany that anyone caught making new coins from melted pieces would be boiled to death. When the government learned they could make coins with cut edges, which would make it easy to tell if a coin was fake, this practice finally started to stop.
Death by impalement. Vlad the Impaler, who ruled Wallachia, now Romania, in the 1400s, may have been the most vocal supporter of hanging people from trees. He was so determined to kill his enemies that his bloodlust led to the creation of the famous vampire Count Dracula. As for the process itself, impalement was a horrible form of torture that went on for a long time before the eventual death. In the past, a stake would be partly sharpened and then pushed into the ground so that the point faced up. The person would then be put on top of the spike. Next, a stick would be stuck through their rectum if they were a guy, or their vagina if they were a woman. The partially greased stake would be pushed deep into the victim's body until they died. The stake would usually come out near the victim's neck, throat, or shoulders. Some of these poles were honed on purpose to make the pain last longer. In some cases, people were impaled for hours or even days. People often said nice things about Vlad the Impaler's military prowess and how he brought order to Wallachia, but he was also cruel. He had a lot of Saxon traders put on spikes in Kronstadt in 1459. In the same year, he nailed officials' hats to their heads because they wouldn't take them off out of religious duty. It is thought that Vlad the Impaler killed around 80,000 people in different ways. Altogether, about 20,000 of them were pierced and put on show outside of Targoviste. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II turned around right away after seeing the sight because it was so scary. It is a widespread misunderstanding that impalement means sticking someone through the middle. Transverse impalement did happen and was a much more effective way to kill someone, but that wasn't usually the goal. In most cases, impalement was a cruel punishment that was meant to last a long time and serve as a warning to others not to mess with the person who was being punished. In the end, Mehmed II wasn't the only one who was scared when they saw thousands of people on spikes. If an attacking army saw something like that, they would have to show how brave they are. It's interesting that the first known account of this kind of torture is from 1772 BC in Babylon, where King Hammurabi ordered that a woman be tortured to death for killing her husband. But this mostly Middle Eastern way of killing people was still used until the 20th century, when the Ottoman government used it during the Armenian slaughter. The slow agony of immurement. The seemingly ordinary word refers to putting someone in a small area where they can't get out except by dying. Across many countries, immurement was a common way to kill someone. People usually did this by putting the victim in a box that looked like a coffin, or sealing them into a wall or some other structure. During the Middle Ages, this was a common sentence for nuns or monks who broke their vow of chastity or spoke out against the church's teachings. These people would be locked in rooms with only small holes for food and water. Therefore, they would not be able to talk to anyone else while they were alone for days, weeks, or even months, until they finally died. The Roman Empire was the first place where immurement was used. It was a punishment for a group of priestesses called the Vestal Virgins. The Vestal Virgins were from good families and swore to be celibate. They also agreed to honor Vesta, the goddess of home and family. Vestal bloodshed was religiously and technically illegal, even though breaking that holy vow meant death. Because of this, immurement was used as an alternative sentence. The people who were putting Vestals to death would dig a small hole in the ground and put food and water inside. The Vestal would be taken to the vault and left to die there. Some people who were imprisoned were only there for a short time, but those who were ordered to die had to face the fact that death was their only way out. King Richard II was the most famous person in medieval times who was thought to be locked up. He was known for ruling without considering facts or circumstances. He died in 1400, and no one knows what happened. There were rumors that he died of hunger while he was locked up in Pontefract Castle. In 1409, 4 clergymen from Bavaria were put to death in Augsburg, Germany, in a very gory way. After being found guilty of sexually abusing children, the Church of Augsburg put each priest in a wooden coffin and sealed it. The coffins were then hung from a tower, and the clerics were left to die of hunger in the air. Some people were imprisoned for a lot longer than you might think. Traveller M.E. Hume Griffith said in 1903 that he had seen the sentence while he was lost in Persia. Men were locked up and left to die in stone blocks, and he heard them pleading for help.
Burning at the stake. During the Middle Ages, those in charge usually tried to make the death penalty fit the crime it was used for. In the Middle Ages, both sexism and prejudice were still very much alive and well. Because this dangerous mix caused so many problems, women were accused of witchcraft or heresy and then burned at the stake. Burning at the stake was first used as a way to kill people in Babylonia. It was later used in Europe during the Middle Ages. During this time, it became very common to burn people to death, from Spanish heretics during the Inquisition to French heroes like Joan of Arc. It was easy to punish them. They would be tied to a stake and burned until they stopped screaming in pain. That being said, sometimes the people in charge would show some kindness by tying a container of gunpowder to the victim. When cooked by the fire, this would go off and kill the person much more quickly. Another method was to hang the subject from a chain noose and kill them before the fire could do much damage. It's shocking that a lot of witchcraft claims during this time didn't come from a legitimate source like the church. People in small places often accused others of heresy or witchcraft because they didn't get along with others. It's scary to think that pointing the finger could kill someone by fire if other people agreed with the claims. People were no longer burned at the stake in England for treason after 1612, but people were still burned at the stake for other crimes well into the 18th century. In the end, it looks like killings in the Middle Ages were meant to show how bad a crime was, but they ended up showing how bloodthirsty people have always been. We can take comfort in the fact that most of the world has moved on from the cruel ways people were killed in the Middle Ages. Only time will tell if people in the future will also get rid of the more modern and humane ways of killing people that are still used today.